afternoon. Welcome to the show. Today we are putting names in focus. What's in a name, right? A lot. Well, in recent years, Queen Charlotte Islands have been changed back to Haida Gwaii, Puget Sound, and Strait of Georgia. They were renamed the Salish Sea more than a decade ago. In Nunavut, leaders have a long list of communities being decolonized and renamed. For example, Cape Dorset, recently renamed Kenite. In Saskatchewan, a derogatory name of a lake was renamed. Language and traditional names were highlighted in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but bureaucracies and governments and often the public struggle to keep up to fight the status quo. So that's exactly what we're talking about here today. To start the conversation, we're joined by Trina Roache. She is the Rogers Chair in Journalism at University of King's College in Halifax. Trina, of course, you would know, she's former APTN News and APTN Investigates award-winning journalist. Her documentary, History Decolonized, looked at the practice of renaming buildings and tearing down statues. Here's a clip.
Statues come down. It happens all around the world.
You're changing history, you're changing culture. You're changing history, you're changing culture. Where does it stop?
We can't change history, we can't rewrite history.
But some say history isn't set in stone.
That's very one-sided. You can't erase histories. Only settler people, only the colonists can erase history.
You can rewrite history. We've got a great example right here, the statue of Edward Cornwallis. It's a sanitized version of history, the history I grew up reading.
Longer than I've been alive, people have been trying to tear that down.
The statue as it is an impediment to progress.
It represents a monument to white supremacist thinking.
Like with Cornwallis, it's not just removing the statue, it's also the reckoning that includes around colonial violence.
It's this dismissiveness. It doesn't exist. Racism doesn't exist in Canada.
But decades of debate over history can lead to historic moments.
Here it is, finally. Reconciliation in action.
Joining us now is Trina Roache. She's the one who did that beautiful documentary. Thanks for being here, Trina. It's so good to see you again. You know, it's interesting. This was, we were seeing that story's from 2018, and it seems like it's super relevant now. You were far ahead of the curve starting that conversation back then, as you're usually ahead of the curve. You know, how does renaming buildings and tearing down statues kind of fit into the larger context of decolonizing our history? I mean, some people, the answer is logical, but I mean, there's some people that might be looking at this going, I don't get it. Like, moving forward doesn't mean tearing down and renaming, right?
Well, yeah, it's funny. You know, when I did that story, and I have to say, when I did that story, I was done filming, done all the interviews, had edited the whole thing. And a week before it went to air is when they decided to take the statue down. And so, so I had a much better ending, but I had to scramble to sort of re-edit the doc. But I've been thinking about this, because decolonizing, and especially now I'm working in a university setting where you sort of hear this, word decolonize, indigenize. And sometimes these words can just kind of become almost meaningless.
White noise.
Soft. Yeah, like reconcile, reconciliation, indigenize. And I've read a few things about it, and sometimes, you sort of see, well, it's incorporating Indigenous perspectives. Is this idea of decolonizing, and that's valuable, obviously, to incorporate Indigenous perspectives. The only issue I take with that, it's a little soft and fluffy, right? Yeah. So you can bring in Indigenous perspectives, but you can make space for those. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. It can kind of be like my view, your view kind of thing. And to me, decolonizing is really understanding an accurate version of history. Because what we have in Canada right now is this sort of creation story and a narrative that very much upholds, is based on white supremacist values. Mm-hmm. And people always sort of shy away from that term. They maybe picture KKK, guys in white sheets, and that's true, that's real. Yeah. But it also just means a society that upholds and values whiteness. And in doing this doc, when I looked at you know, when they put up that statue of Cornwallis, the papers at the time were all just like idolizing British values and British sovereignty and whiteness, right? And I mean, Indigenous people, Black people at that time, African Nova Scotians, had no rights. Racism was so rampant. Indigenous people weren't even, you know, Canadian citizens, not until like 1956. And so when you don't understand that history, when you sort of buy into this narrative, it's not about, you hear it in that clip and you hear it all the time, erasing history, whitewashing history. You know, it's not about that. It's about telling an accurate history. And so whenever you rename something or whenever you take a statue down, it's an opportunity for education, right? It's an opportunity to have that discussion. It's an opportunity to tell a more accurate history. And if we want to call that decolonizing history, then I think that that's a way we can approach that conversation. And when we see it, because it's also an opportunity for racism to rear its head, which often happens. But when we have that sort of backlash against renaming something or tearing down a statue, it's because it threatens the social order. So that right there should make you question why. Like, why does it threaten the social order to take down a statue, right? So what's at stake? So I think it unpacks a lot when you rename or take down something.
Well, 100%. And, you know, and I'm always interested too, and it's not just, you know, non-Indigenous people, white people, European settlers that are saying, well, stop tearing these things down. These things don't need to be renamed. We could just put up another plaque beside it saying, you know, with a footnote to him, you don't need to do this. It's trying to erase history. It's not just European settler descendants that make those arguments. Some of our own people are saying that too, which is always kind of surprises me. But I guess, you know, is there a greater appetite do you see now for having these conversations about how, you know, having these street names like Dundas or, you know, Bishop Grannon here in Winnipeg, whatever it is, that it's honoring almost, not almost, I guess it is honoring, right? Yeah. You know, like, is there more of an appetite for people to see why it's important to make these changes?
I think you're starting to see it now, but it totally is. So a statue by itself is not educational, right? It glorifies someone. So Confederate statues in the States, what would you learn about slavery by looking at a statue of a slave owner or a slave trader, right? Like what value does that have?
It's
right?
honoring.
The lesson is that you're commemorating, you're upholding that person and those ideals. And so to me, that never, unless you're going to put up like a bunch of statues and a whole lot of information. I mean, I was really struck when I went to Germany for a journalism conference pre-pandemic, back when we did that stuff. Yeah. And just, I mean, like, look at Germany. Like, you don't put up a Nazi flag or symbol. You're not allowed to anywhere, right? That's not allowed. There's a lot of education. There's the Berlin Wall and that whole site. There's a memorial for the murdered Jews in Europe, right? They have the Holocaust memorial, but there's nowhere that just puts up a symbol and says, oh, look, like, well, it's educational. We don't want to take it
Here's
down.
Hitler. Here's a swastika. It's just our history, and it's educational. Don't be offended by it. That doesn't happen. So it is interesting when we have people, you know, clinging to sort of John A. Macdonald or Cornwallis as being like, this is just history, and to leave it be. I'm curious, you know, and you must have these conversations, you know, with family, with your students, you know, just your perspective as a journalist, covering these sort of things. From where we are now, where do you think what needs to happen next? Or what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, and I think I didn't really answer it kind of follows on the last question, because you said like, what's changed? And I think when you look at like Black Lives Matter, when, you know, after George Floyd was killed by the police officer, and you have this social movement with the unmarked graves being recovered, I think that you can't, like, that in and of itself points to, it's like, oh, look, like proof. Proof of this history that Indigenous people know is true. And so that kind of pulls back the curtain. I think whenever you rename something, and whenever you sort of expose that history, you know, things have been renamed, right? Like, again and again. Every place here in Mi'kma'ki still has a Mi'kmaq name. right? And so these are the conversations, like people, and we have, just back to the other point there, is that like, there was people here who said, well, maybe we should leave that statue up. Maybe it's a conversation point. I think most people are just happy it's down, to be honest. And now it's called Peace and Friendship Park here. Sir John A. Macdonald is now Bayview School, right? So there's these name changes, and the world continued. Yeah, everybody's fine. So I think that there has to be, because there's still a lot more work to do, right? And renaming something is so small, but there's still a town called Cornwallis. There's still a place in Nova Scotia called Squaw Island, right? Yeah. Like that's still, like, there's still these places. And so if we're okay with that, like if we allow those places and names to stand, then what are we really saying? Like, what am I saying to my kids if we don't have that discussion and say that's not right and that needs to change? And that's or have a discussion about, well, that statue, well, I know, he issued scalps on Mi'kmaq people, men, women, and children. And
but that's just history, and be okay with when you walk by it and have him staring over you as you're grabbing a hamburger down the street or something. Just be fine with it.
But you can see now in today, I don't even know if I answered your question, but I can see now today, like we sort of have these very like these views of things that sometimes there's like no middle ground, right? Like people just like have a view of something. And I mean, we saw it with the pandemic, really brought that out.
Yeah. Yes.
Like people putting like, science in quotes and things like that. Like, and so we can just question kind of everything now. And I think that really, and especially as journalists, like what is truth, right? What is accurate? And we have to just always pursue that. And we can't shy away from hard truths. And we have to persist. And so, and definitely in journalism, I think that when we shy away, like my thing, cause like, I don't think that like, I mean, I've argued about this and I say like, there's no such thing as an unbiased media, right? We all have bias. Yep. But if your bias is built on that Sir John A. Macdonald was a great guy and Canada's creation story and all of that stuff, and then you show up and you cover an Indigenous protest, how are you viewing that? So it becomes, there's a real impact in the real world when we hold these truths in our head, right? Because we're, especially in journalism, because we're going out and we're covering these things and we're supposed to be accurate and taking notes. And if we're if our worldview is different, then we're othering marginalized people and Indigenous people.
Love it. Trina, we are out of time for this. I have to move on to our next guest here. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to see and talk to you. And I'm going to have you back on because I want to do something about media bias too. So we'll have you back on for that. One of my favorite topics of conversation. Thanks so much.
Well, Alan, thanks, Melissa.
Well, it's one thing to deal with a single statue. It's another to have a daily reminder of genocide just walking or biking down the street. Robert Jago is a freelance writer in Vancouver. He wrote an article for the Canadian Geographic last year examining the renaming movement, and in particular Dundas Street in Toronto. Here's my conversation with him. Robert, thank you so much for joining us. I want to ask you, what inspired you to write the renaming piece?
The piece about Columbus, that was that came up at the time that people were looking at changing the name of some different places in Ontario, and I wanted to use that as a jumping off point to talk about renaming BC, which is just one of those names that has permanently nagged me as horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, the license plates say it's the best place on earth, and it's named after an imperial power and a genocidal monster. So it seems like there ought to be a better name. It's one of those perennial issues that needs to eventually be addressed. So if I have the opportunity to go and discuss it, and I can use the renaming of places in Ontario as a jumping off point for that, then of course I would.
Let's talk about the article they did for Canadian Geographic examining Dundas, for example. Walk us through the work that goes into that. Did you find that the feedback from that article was surprising in any way?
The feedback was largely positive. Of course, there's always the people that roll their eyes and say, what now? Isn't it enough? We don't have to change the name of everything. Mm-hmm. And I found that generally those are people who didn't read it. For people who read it, the main criticism I received was from other First Nations people in BC who objected to any name being proposed for the whole territory. Some people wanted to bring in a name from another language or something, which is fine. But they didn't want something Salish specific for the region, which is neither here nor there, really. But beyond that, there wasn't any really interesting or unique or new criticism that I saw from that. It's just the baseline that you see from non-natives every time you write anything.
Right. I love that, the eye roll. And everybody watching knows, like, oh yeah, that, yes, right, the eye roll, we all know it. I'm curious to, if you could share with us just a little bit, who is Dundas? Because not probably all of our readers or watchers know who this guy was, what he was all about too.
Well, sure. I mean, Dundas, the place, is the center of Toronto. It's a town, it's a county. If you ever see a picture of Toronto and you see all the big neon lights, well, not neon lights, the big video screens everywhere and all the people, that's Dundas Square, which is where you meet everybody in Toronto. Dundas himself was a colonial official, and he was a member of the British Parliament, representative from Scotland, I believe. And he was also a very wealthy merchant. And he was, there's a quote about conservatives that says that the point of conservatives is to stand athwart the rushing tide of history and shout stop. The thing that he said stop to was the end of slavery in the British Empire, the end of the slave trade. So there was this horrible thing that happened off the coast of Africa. A British ship shelled this town and murdered a lot of people. So Parliament rose up and they finally had the power, thanks to William Wilberforce, to get rid of slavery. They voted for it, and right before it was enacted, up comes Dundas. And Dundas, big friend of Canada, as a colonial official at the time, by the way, he stopped that. He put a wrench in it and stopped the end of slavery and delayed it for decades. And during those decades, hundreds of thousands of people who were taken into slavery died on the Middle Passage. Hundreds of thousands more died during slavery. And all of those wouldn't have had he not stood up as this conservative capitalist wrecker and wrecked it. And on his face, what he did was the typical liberal thing that happens here all the time. He said, let's study it, let's work on it a little bit before we make a huge decision here, and that put it back decades.
Yeah. Do you find that there's an increased appetite for having conversations about these, kind of nefarious characters who we've named streets or buildings or whatever after, or renaming like the province of British Columbia? Is there an increased appetite among non-Indigenous people, in your perspective, that you see, that you hear?
Well, I mean, since that article came out, at the time that article came out, there was an appetite to look at the names of people that places are named after. In the last month, maybe the last 2 months, that appetite has become a forceful push where people have become very determined to change the names of places, to fit political agendas, nakedly so, to even dictate how you pronounce the word, which is fair and it's proper, but it's in the context of European war. Because I think we all know Kiev, the place with the chicken,
right.
Chicken Kiev, right?
Yeah.
Kiev, which is a Russian word, which news to me, and Lvov, which is the old Polish town from back in the day, and a million other places. We used to call it the Ukraine. But in the context of war, suddenly non-natives have become very militant about the importance of names and about how we should change them from Kiev to Kyiv, from Lvov to, I don't even know, from the Ukraine to Ukraine, because they understand now that names have political importance, have like, you'll see people who would be in the comments for everything that one of us would have written, now saying, how dare you say the Ukraine? Don't you understand what those kind of words mean? So they understand the importance now more than they ever have before. And they're really forceful about it, which, it's fair. It's a war. They're murdering children, right? Yeah. And so I think, now they see it and hopefully, although almost certainly not, some of that could inform how they see our requests.
What do you think the big place names are going to be for people like our audience to watch for? Like, what do you see kind of high up on the agenda of like, this is probably going to get changed, or whether it be a place, a building, a street, a province?
Well, we see the changes in Edmonton, which are good, and we see the Dundas change coming up, which is good. We see a promise in Quebec to remove the N-word from everywhere. Finally getting around to that. So those are easy, and it's easy to remove a name, but it's harder to return to a name. And I think if we see any of those where we're returning to an older name, I think that is actual progress. Because, it's easy to use, it's easy to take away a name and replace it with something else, hence X University. It's harder to learn about the place and return it to what it was before, because that means recognizing the history of the place and recognizing the continuity of that history and the ownership held by somebody else.
What more can we do to kind of expedite these changes? Of course, you said that there's always going to be people that cling to like an eye roll and don't want to see change. They just want to see a plaque put up that says, "Oh yeah, well, sure, maybe that guy was a little bit of a jerk, but move on." What needs to happen, I guess, to make movement in this happening? Is it politicians that have to get involved? Is it Indigenous people that have to get involved? What would be the perfect mix, I guess?
Well, it's two things. Number one, this is sort of outside of the scope of that article and outside of like the typical way of doing it. But I think we really need to look at our approach for renaming things and for getting rid of the names of places. Instead of utterly replacing a name, we need to introduce a new name in parallel with the existing name. Doing that is what they've done in New Zealand with Aotearoa and the other name for the country. And it gets over the standard argument, which actually is valid, that it's very expensive to change the name of a place. Well, it doesn't cost anything to have two names for a place. Colombie-Britannique costs nothing, Nouvelle-Brunswick costs nothing. Nouvelle-Écosse costs nothing. I don't know that for sure. Huge cost, I don't know. But so that's one thing, is that we need to look at maybe introducing our names in parallel, coming to an agreement and putting those forward. But the other thing, and the thing from the article, is this body, the Geographical Names Board of Canada. There actually is a very easy mechanism for regular citizens or band councils to change the name of places. So if you can get your band council to identify a place, propose a name, submit it to the Geographical Names Board of Canada or its provincial equivalent, and their address is on the website, their email is on the website. If you get them to do that and say, I want it to be this name, here's why, here's the support we have, they'll do it. It's a very low bar. Names change, I think in the article, I think I mentioned they change every 6 hours, the name of a place changes in Canada. It's really, really common, simple process. And the majority of those changes seem to be towards Indigenous names. Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating. We've let people know at the bottom of their screens where they can go and find this article that you wrote. I love the idea of just getting more people talking about it, because that's how change happens, right? If it's just a couple people in a corner highbrowing it, change isn't necessarily going to come swiftly, if at all, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Just talk to your band council if you have the opportunity and say, I think that river that's named after this guy that murdered 10 people is bad.
Yeah.
And we have our own name for it. Let's use that one. And they send a letter and it's done. It's quite a simple, direct process at that level.
Love it.
So,
well, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to watching the names topple like statues here.
cool. Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
So further to that, changing how to get a name changed. It's the Geographical Names Board of Canada. It's been around since 1897, changing hundreds of place names across the country and in provinces and territories ever since. You can find it on the government's website. All the info that you need to get the ball rolling is right there, how to change a name. Fascinating to learn about this, Robert. Thanks. We need to take a break, but still ahead, a BC woman struggled to have her language's symbols recognized for a business name there. Stay with us. Welcome back. Cheyenne Cunningham never imagined that registering a business for her husband would turn into such an ordeal. She intended to use the Hunkaminam word for grizzly bear, but the BC Business Registry would not accept non-Roman numeral characters. So Daryl Stranger, he spoke with her about all this hassle. Here's that interview.
Cheyenne, thanks so much for joining us here on InFocus.
Thanks for having me.
So tell us a little bit about the language you were trying to register the business in.
So it's the Hunkaminam language, which is one of 3 dialects that are spoken in the Lower Mainland and the southern Vancouver Island, BC. So there's Hulkaminam, which is the island dialect. there's Hunkaminam, which is the Lower Mainland dialect, and Halkamilam, which is upriver dialect. And the Hunkaminam language specifically is spoken by the Keetsi, Kwantlen, Coquitlam, Musqueam, Tsawwassen, and Tsleil-Waututh people.
Okay, so how did they let you know that this couldn't happen?
They let me know through a series of emails, which resulted in a phone call to kind of clear it up. So on June 10th of 2020, I submitted a request to the BC Registry Services to have the business name registered. It was denied almost immediately. So I received an email the same day, and then I had the follow-up call the next day.
Now, they offered you a different version of the name, anglicized or anglicized. I'm not sure exactly how to say that one, but why did you say no to that one?
I mean, I declined the anglicized version just because as Indigenous people, it's our inherent right to use our language. We have a lot of language keepers that have spent their lives learning and revitalizing the Hunkaminam language. And I think it's important that we see it within the broader communities and spelled correctly.
So why was it so important for you to have that name in your language?
Personally, for me, I've spent a long time learning the language, and out of respect for those that have taught me, I think it's important that we start to use the names in Indigenous languages, not only to represent our language, but who we are as Indigenous peoples.
So, Cheyenne, what does it say about governments and bureaucracies that they aren't prepared for traditional spellings and characters?
I mean, I really feel that it speaks volumes to their commitment to work with Indigenous folks. There's been a lot of talk with very little action. I mean, I understand that it takes time, but these conversations have been happening for quite some time. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its calls to action in 2015. So, I mean, the government has had 7 years or so to implement the 94 calls to action.
Mm-hmm. And now you did file a human rights complaint, right? So can you tell us about that and you know where you're at in that process?
Yeah, so I filed with the BC Human Rights Tribunal on June 24th of 2020. And my main goal in doing this was to raise awareness and request support in calling on the BC Registry Services to amend their laws to include Indigenous languages as registered business names. And the whole process took about 9 months.
Okay, so where exactly is the case at now then after doing all of that?
Well, ultimately we had to settle. You know, it was taking a really long time, and they kind of just said that it's going to take several years for this to happen. So there's not really any point in moving forward with court litigation, I guess, at that time. So what they did was they, as part of the resolution, the Ministry of Citizen Services agreed to provide a letter to the Assistant Deputy Minister Reconciliation Table Committee to bring their attention and to the issue and consider the use of Indigenous languages in business names going forward.
So what was it like for you to hear that? Was that frustrating at all, or you know, kind of what are your thoughts on that?
To hear that it was going to take years, or
yeah, just the whole process and you know having to settle
it was quite frustrating, and it took a really long time. I don't know if that was because of COVID or what have you, but yeah, it was quite frustrating and a little disheartening, to be honest.
So what do you hope maybe happens should somebody else come and do this, or what are you hoping for the future if something like this comes up again?
I mean, I really hope that they get it done a little sooner than 2 years. I would like to see Indigenous languages across Canada, not only in British Columbia, but I think that we have a right to use our languages for business names and otherwise. So, yeah.
Have you heard of anybody else having this issue at all, or were you kind of the first to sort of bring this to light?
Not business names, but I did hear about or read about some individuals trying to get their ancestral names on their passports and birth certificates and things of that nature.
Okay, and now we did reach out to the BC government, and they said it would cost a lot to change that over. What do you kind of say to that, and just that message?
Well, I mean, they wrote entire reports and they passed the Indigenous Languages Act, which states that the government will provide funding specifically for Indigenous language revitalization initiatives. So the money should be a non-issue.
And so, I mean, I get that there's still, the issue at hand here, but do you have any, I don't know if solutions is the right word, but, see anything that maybe could make it an easier process for somebody else in the future? Or any advice for somebody in the future?
I mean, I think that the more of us that get together and file these reports, it is tedious, but I think that is kind of the move forward right now. We just need to gather together and keep reporting, and hopefully change will come sooner than later. And
lastly here, Cheyenne, just kind of what's next for you going forward in regards to all this?
Well, I'm doing my PhD in language and literacy education, so I still would like to be an advocate for Indigenous language revitalization. Last Tuesday, I was invited to give a guest lecture to an SFU undergrad class on naming and policy. It was for a linguistics class at SFU, so that's kind of what I'm doing, is just trying to raise awareness.
All right, well, certainly best of luck with everything going on in the future, and thank you for taking a few minutes to share your story with us.
Thank you.
She's a warrior for sure. Thanks for that, Daryl. So the ministry in charge of business registration in British Columbia says that they've now gathered a list of special characters used with Indigenous languages, and they have a new system where they can accept Indigenous language characters to be used in the future. So way to go, Cheyenne. Well, a Yellowknife mother, Shanae Gandaleg Valpi, she believes that traditional names tie people to their culture and their teachings. She named her daughters Zahaya and Nael. It's Chippewa words, but the Northwest Territories wasn't able to handle these characters. So same sort of thing we were hearing in BC. Charlotte Moore Jacobs brought us that story back in January this year.
Okay, now you can go over it with the blue.
For Shanae Gandaleg Valpi and her daughters Zahaya and Nael, there's pride in having traditional Venezuelan names. But there's also challenges in getting bureaucrats to recognize proper spelling of names with traditional accents and symbols.
Every time that I have to write out their name on a legal document, it doesn't feel right, and having to explain to my daughters that this is how I have to write it on these papers because they question why I'm writing why am I writing it wrong?
Gandaleg Valpi is a Yellowknife resident and member of the Little Dene First Nation.
Lift your feet, Zahaya.
APTN first covered her story in 2016, but she's still fighting.
But if it's an official language here, why is it so hard?
Indigenous individuals can now apply to reclaim their names as written on passports and other identity documents.
Despite federal legislation from June 2021, the Northwest Territories government still hasn't changed their policy, which only recognizes the Roman alphabet.
With that, you still cannot use the proper spelling. It says everywhere of how important it is to reclaim the language. And this is a step into doing it through our birth certificates.
In 2019, Gandaleg Valpi's letter asking for diacritics in Indigenous names to be recognized was tabled in the legislature, but no further action was taken. APTN News reached out to the Languages Commissioner of the NWT, but they were unable to respond by airtime. Reclaiming Indigenous names runs in the family. In Little, Shanae's uncle, J.C. Catholic, is in the process of legally changing his name back. Missionaries who came to the area had projected a colonized version of the family name.
To them, Gandaleg sounds like Catholic.
JC says identity is tied to all Indigenous names.
A lot of people say you come from this tribe, that kind of thing. It's okay, right? You can say, yeah, I'm part of, like the Tsul'kalu Nation, right? Chippewa Nation. I'm part of that. And they say, okay, which family you come from.
Do you like to teach people how to say your name properly?
And do you like your name?
Yeah,
Why do you like your name?
because my name's different. No one else has it.
Sahat Ah's name means when the sun peeks through, while Na'el, her name, is a word to describe caribou crossing a river. For Shanae, traditional names tie an individual to their culture and their teachings.
Having her carry that name means the word's not lost. And we don't use that word anymore because of the declining numbers in caribou, and we don't see caribou crossing rivers anymore, but this little girl carries it around like a badge.
I'll try to write your name.
9 of the 11 languages in the Northwest Territories are Indigenous. So we went to the Languages Commissioner to see if there was an update since the story was done 2 months ago. Has there been any movement on allowing traditional names? They said in a statement to us that since the story, the Commissioner of Official Languages for the Northwest Territories reached out to the Northwest Territories Minister of Health and Social Services, which this issue falls under, and they are, quote, looking at moving things forward to remedy this problem. Well, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, a student at the university formerly known as Ryerson talks about renaming that institution. Stay with us. Welcome back. Statues toppled all over Canada and the United States last year, including at the former Ryerson University in downtown Toronto, where a statue of their namesake even lost his head. Egerton Ryerson was a key influence in the design of residential schools, so you can imagine it wasn't exactly a welcoming place for Indigenous students. The university is voting for a name change. That process is still ongoing, and for Jeremy Caribou, it can't happen soon enough. He grew up in northern Manitoba and now works as an Indigenous Initiative liaison at the university. Here's an interview with him from last week. Jeremy, it's a pleasure to have you on to talk about the importance of renaming. Just give our audience a little bit of a background about yourself, how you ended up at the university formerly known as the R word.
Well, my name is, Niduma Nakawidanown Nitisidigasun Jeremy Caribou. I'm originally from Pucketawagan, which is situated on the Mississippi, now Churchill River in a northwestern part of the province. Yeah. And prior to me coming back to school, I worked in the trades for about 20 years, from menial jobs, from like stacking lumber to operating heavy equipment to finally being a iron worker, structural welder. Yeah. And
so then you're like, you know what, because I mean, that's a lot of manual labor, right? At some point I could see, and you're a smart guy, so I could see how there'd be an evolution to say, I want to take a break from that and get back into learning. Why did you pick X University, and what was the first thing you did? Because it was that time known as Ryerson, right?
Well, at the time when I was working at trades, I experienced a lot of racism, right? Like, for instance, like some individuals would say that like I don't pay taxes, which is inaccurate, and like the only place you don't pay taxes is on a reserve, as you know, and it's like 95% unemployment rate, right? Or even higher in some places.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then also too, like like some individuals would say like why don't you go tell that raccoon to off, right? Or being called hunter and gatherer. But
oh my God.
Like at the time, like I didn't know how to respond, right? Because I wasn't like, I didn't have the tools to fundamentally refute these anti-Indigenous moments in the workplace that has been normalized, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I guess you think too, like, you know, if you can get out of that environment and go somewhere where there's, you know, an institute of higher learning, you kind of get the impression that you're going to get away from that sort of thing. But when you're walking into a building named after, you know, a grub like Ryerson.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, in some instances too, like in regards to like anti-Indigenous racism, like I would, like when I work on a road out west, right? When we do shopping days with the crew, we'd go into the mall or in the grocery store, and I'd always like jokingly tell my coworkers like, don't worry, everything's on me, because like all eyes on deck will be on me, right? So you can just take whatever you want, because like like especially like a dark-skinned Indigenous person, like we're constantly gawked at or followed around, right? Sometimes even right up to the till. Yeah. Yeah.
So take us through the journey. You know, when you would have started at Ryerson, there was very little conversation being had about renaming. How much did the graves being confirmed at Kamloops, is that kind of what really got the ball rolling on the ground there at the university?
Well, from my perspective, like the Standing Strong Committee was already in the process of deciding whether to bring down the statue and change the name, but then they uncovered those graves, right?
Yeah.
And then they made a decision right away. They're going to change the name. But if they didn't find those graves, they made a decision, right, of not changing the name or taking down the statue if these graves were unfound, but found at a later date, would have been too late to like decide to change it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Could you describe for me, when the statue came down, how'd that feel for you as a student, for an Indigenous man?
Well, for me, because I've been working, since my first year, I participated in various departments, initiatives in regards to reconciliation, I co-developed a Indigenous field trip tour guide for the institution, and then after that, I've been I've been invited by various departments to come and do land-based educations or presentations, and for 3 years I've been smearing his name, right? Because when I first enrolled into the institution, I didn't even know who he was, right? Until it was too late. I was already committed to getting an advanced education. And when the statue came down, and after smearing his name for 3 years, I was actually happy. Yeah.
You're part of, you're part of the Indigenous Initiative Liaison at the university. Are we getting close to picking a name at this point? Is there, Indigenous students that are leaning towards it being named something that you could share with us now, or where are we at?
It's confidential. I don't even know about it. They keep on they say they're gonna have a name by June, and then some people say by the fall time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm not part of the committee, and even if I was, I wouldn't be able to mention it.
I thought maybe people in high places and they whisper things, and you could just kind of spill the beans here for our audience on APTN.
No. I don't know anybody in high places.
Me neither. Don't worry. I'm here with you.
That's what I'm trying to achieve. Yeah.
I'm curious what you think, in the broader context of, changing these names, across the country. Do you think that there's a greater desire to do that now, or do you think that it's always going to be that uphill battle to get change like that, to get these kind of characters, taken off, not being heralded as heroes basically, but having something named after them?
It's always going to be an uphill battle from my perspective, because how for Indigenous peoples and in a Canadian context, the education curriculum was designed to vaporize Indigenous culture, identity, and history, which has transformed and mutated into the functional superstructure it currently is, which doesn't talk about social issues such as individuals who influence and eradicate Indigenous people, such as John A. Macdonald, right? Nobody, the general public is not aware of who these individuals are because how the education system has been designed, right?
Yeah.
Because it only how it I don't know how it is now, but when I was in school, in elementary and high school, it prepares the individual to become highly competitive in a transactional market. And from my view, the meaning of life in neoliberal states is you're nothing but a transaction, right, to the type of refreshments they'll serve at your service.
Yep, you got that. I think we're all, part of that system, obviously. I'm thinking ahead to, we've got people who, speaking of, I'm born and raised in this country. I'm white on my mom's side, Indigenous on my dad's side, Métis. We don't learn about these things. We have none of these names mean anything, to people who are born and raised here and have family roots here for generation after generation after generation. Is it a challenge, do you think, to have this conversation and get new Canadians on board to see the problems with these names? Or do you think that it's even more difficult because they kind of get here and it's like, I don't care what the names of any of this stuff would be. Like, I'm curious how you think with the increase of settlers that we have coming to this country, is the answer sort of maybe in there for the future to get rid of names and places named after these nefarious people, or?
Sure, for sure. Like they have to, like, rename places to original place names. For instance, such as like Toronto. That's not the proper way you pronounce it, right? It's like Toronto or even Winnipeg, right?
Yeah.
Like Winnipeg, like murky waters. Nobody doesn't even have a clue, like settlers or foreigners or immigrants, right? They don't have a clue of what these names, like these city names mean, right? Yeah, like Chicago to.
Well, maybe there should be a committee struck. I pick you to be like head of the committee that you can go from one coast to the next and make sure that everybody knows what the traditional names are and make the case to have them referred to as such. I mean, I think that would be, get people used to it. Like when they come in, right? Come from another country, get them used to calling it by its traditional name. Get kids right from, kindergarten classes upwards, knowing what it is.
Yes, for sure. That is a form of like land reclamation or land back, like renaming our original place names to what they were. Yeah.
Well, Jeremy, I thank you for your time, and I'm glad that the conversation, the conversation does seem that it's happening among larger groups of people and more often. So I think, we're probably looking at some movement, and it's people like you keeping it on the front burner there. So thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
It was great talking to him and all of our guests. That is a wrap on our show today. Next week, tune in as we recap the Indigenous delegation's pilgrimage to Rome, looking for answers from the Catholic Church there with regards to their role in residential schools. Not everybody, however, thinks it's a worthwhile endeavor. We're going to have a variety of voices on next week weighing in. Till then, I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great afternoon.